Trayvon here, and today we're doing another Swift tutorial video. Today's video we're going to talk about how to create a struct. A struct is a data structure that just holds a set of fields and functions. It's very similar to a class if you're familiar with classes from other programming languages, which also has structs too, but classes are very common. There's slight differences between the two. We can talk about the differences maybe at the end of the video, but we're just going to get started with creating our struct. So if you've been watching some of my other tutorial videos, you know that we're building a Twitter client app similar to the one that you may have on your phone today. And so to start off, the struct that I've chosen to create first is a tweet struct. So I've looked at Twitter's API. So this is their developer site, dev.twitter.com, and they have various common objects that exist within the Twitter developer ecosystem. So you have tweets, users, entities, places. So we're all familiar with tweets. Status updates is another word for it, if you will. So I kind of looked at what the fields are in a tweet that are included in a typical Twitter response, and this is what they are. So our struct will mimic this very much. So that way when we make calls to Twitter and we get the data back, we can easily recreate this thing in our app. So I've already taken the liberty to copy what these things were, put it into a document. I'm basically going to copy and paste this into Xcode so I can look at what I'm doing while I'm creating this. So when I create project files, I like to definitely keep the project organized. Projects get big. Having a bunch of files just there, it gets confusing. So this is a model. The struct will be a model. A model to me is the most basic type of structure class that you can have. It just only has fields. Like I rarely put functions inside of a model. Like to me, models are just data binding objects, meaning like they should just hold data and be passed. They shouldn't like perform functions. Apple implements or recommends this MVC model, which is basically a model view controller, meaning your classes should either be a model, it should be a view, or it should be a controller. Controllers where like all the logic and data processing happens. I can't speak, I'm sorry. But all the processing happens inside of the controller. The view is just, what people see. So like the storyboard would be the view controller, where all your functions and processing happens. And then the model, which hasn't been created yet, which we're about to create, which just holds the data that, the application knows what type of object it is. Oh, this is a tweet, this is a user. So to get started, let's create a new folder or a group, and I'm going to call that group models. Simple enough. And our first model will be a tweet. Now, I typically like to prefix the name of models based off of like if it's a part of some type of group of things. So because this is a Twitter app, a lot of these models will have something to do with Twitter. So I'm going to prefix it with Twitter. Why? Because Twitter has objects such as places, size, and some other generic thing. So place, for instance, if I just create a model called place, there are tons of other libraries that I could implement that might have an idea of a place. Like Facebook has places, Facebook has events. So if Twitter had an event, I just don't want to call this thing event and then have two conflicting classes. So I'm going to prefix it with Twitter. I'm going to call it Twitter place, Twitter event, Twitter tweet, Twitter user. So Twitter tweet. And I didn't tell you. So, all right, so I'm going to choose a Swift file. So Cocoa Touch class kind of goes back to this whole Objective-C days. So basically it's going to create like, you can create a subclass of an Objective-C object. So like init objects, view controllers, all that. We off that now. We're trying to focus on, Swift, use Swift files, Swift implementations. So that's why I chose the Swift object. So Twitter tweet. So it basically creates a new file. the top is just like some metadata, the file name, the application name, who created it, when, some copyright information. So there's nothing there. And so to create a struct, we just follow these simple steps. Type the word struct, space, the name of your struct, so Twitter tweet, and add these curly brackets. Save, done. I have a struct now. It doesn't do anything, but it's a struct. Cool. So now we're going to add some fields to our struct, and these are the fields that we're going to add based off of how Twitter defines their object. Let me comment these out so I don't have an error the entire time. So with these fields, in Swift we have what's known as optionals, which basically mean that a field or variable can be optional. It doesn't have to be set. That's kind of is very cool. I think it helps with a lot of error checking and things like that. Like a lot of times, me in the past, programs would crash because an object is supposed to be set and it's not set, but you're referencing it thinking it's set, it's not set, it crashes because, hey, I was expecting to get some information from here and it wasn't there. With this optional thing, you can't even do that. Like once something is set as an optional, you have to like forcibly, they call it unwrap it. But there's ways to like prevent crashes from happening within an optional that we can get into later. So how I'm going to look at what should be an optional and what shouldn't be an optional is basically if I create a Twitter tweet or if I get a Twitter tweet back from Twitter's API, what information will always be included will basically not be an optional. So there's not too many things within this field list that holds true for. Like ID, for instance, will always be included in a Twitter response, but should never be included when you're creating a tweet on the client side because you don't know what the ID is. The ID is generated once you actually send it to Twitter. Same thing with like, I don't know, coordinates created at. You can create it, but Twitter's not going to accept what the date that you put. It's going to take it the date that it was actually created on Twitter's platform. So most of the stuff's going to be optional. The only thing that I see that is required is text. Why? When I post a tweet, I can't just post an empty tweet. It has to have some type of, it has to have a status or text in it. So that is like the only thing that's not optional. Everything else is pretty much optional. So to show what that looks like, we're going to create a field. And so when creating field, there's two ways to define a field. You either do let or you do var. Let means that it cannot be modified once it's set. So it's like a constant, if you will. That's not good because things need to modify this tweet. So none of these are going to be lets. They're all going to be bars, which is mutable, means it can be changed. So I can change it at any time. So when I read the data back, I can set it. When I'm creating a new thing, I can set it. So first thing is coordinates. And so notice the type here. So I basically recorded what the field name is, what the type is according to Twitter, and then if it can be, if it's expected to always be in Twitter's response. So this will be a custom object that I'm going to call Twitter coordinate. And I'm going to get an error because iOS has no idea what a Twitter coordinate is because I haven't created it yet, the struct or the class for it, depending on how I choose to implement it. The next one is created at. I'm going to make that a date. That's how I want to read it within my program. Twitter returns it as a string, but I can easily convert that to a date. Now notice how Twitter names it created underscore at, and I named it created at, and I'm starting everything with lowercase letters. So if you're familiar with like different casing schemes, I guess you can call it, there's camel case, there's Pascal case, and there's snake case. I think the underscore is snake case. So Twitter uses snake case. I've noticed dealing with Swift that camel case, which is the lowercase first and then every other word is capitalized after that, seems to be common. And then like Pascal case, which would be this, where everything is capital. So like, okay, yeah. So camel, every word following the first word is going to be capitalized. Pascal case, every word is capitalized. I noticed that like in like C# and things like that. But like I said, Swift tends to be camel case. So I'm going to stick with the norm for Swift since I'm building this in Swift. If I was writing this in C#, I would do Pascal case. So I typically stay with the language. So yeah, back to creating these fields. So entities, another custom type. Okay, so ID. Notice I have an ID and an ID string. Twitter does that because ID is returned as a 64-bit integer, meaning it can get pretty large. And some programming languages can't support an integer that large. They're stuck at, I think, 32-bit or 16-bit. I'm going to say 32. So they created ID string, which is a string representation of ID, to allow that to work. So I think JavaScript is one of the languages where a 64-bit integer can't be read, cause the program to crash. So ID string was created to supplement that or fix that. In Swift, 64-bit integer apparently works, so I don't see a reason to implement an ID string there because it's just a duplicate of what we already have. So I'm going to leave it out. Or what I could do is create a getter. So if you don't know what getters and setters are, they're basically like functions for properties or to set fields. So if you're familiar with a function would be like get name and return string, return blah blah, right? So notice how I have the function name, these parentheses, and then the return type. And then if we implemented this as a property, which has a getter and setter, I could do this. I could say name string, and then I'll just put these curly brackets, right? So it's different from a function because if it was a function, it would have the parentheses. This doesn't have parentheses, but it still has the curly brackets, and then it has two internal functions, which is get set. So we're doing ID string, so let me change this back to ID string. And what I could do here is return string nope, not for that. Can I do this? Let's cast it. Okay, so it's nullable or it's optional. So before we do that, let's do this. ID string needs to be optional as well. So guard let is basically like saying if I'm assigning something at the same time and checking its condition. So let ID equals self ID. So what this statement is going to do is if self.id is optional, or it is an optional. If self ID is nil or null, if it's not set, basically, then it's going to return whatever I do here. So I'm going to also return nil. If it's not, meaning if self ID is actually set, then the program execution will continue to the next line. And in this next line, what I'm going to do is return the string version of self ID. But I did let gives me the the actual value. Notice how it's not an optional there because it's actually been unwrapped, so it unwraps it for me. Can I get string value out of here? I think description. Yeah, that should return a string. I'm still new to Swift. I've done 2 projects here, but I'm still new to it. So I'm going to make this a read-only property. So I'm not going to have a setter. I'm only going to have a getter. So once this is set, then this will be the string representation of that. So yeah, so these would be fields, and then this would be a property. That's how it was in Objective-C. I'm not sure if that carries over to Swift, but a property is basically like a field with the getter and setter. A field is just a field. It just holds data, but it doesn't have a getter and setter. So I hope I'm explaining that right. Hope I'm not wrong. If I am, go ahead and correct me, add a comment. I will fix it. I'm okay with admitting that I may be wrong. And I use field and property interchangeably. I know that's probably wrong, but I definitely do. So like I just did the ID string just to give an example of how to create a property with the getter and setter. Once again, it's not necessary because 64-bit integer works in Swift. So I'm not even gonna do the string version of these things. I might just not gonna do it in this video, not now. I know you're probably bored of watching me just type all these things out. Should just fast forward it. Place. Once again, this is a custom thing. Possibly sensitive. I wonder what filters they have in place to check what can make something possibly sensitive. Quoted status ID. Nope. Scopes. So scopes. Twitter says this is an object. So an object is a set or a collection of key value pairs. So basically a dictionary. If you know what a dictionary is, that's what a dictionary is. So in Swift, this is how we define a dictionary. And set dictionary, then we do like, what the key value pairs, what are the types for the key and what are the types for the value. So key should always be a string. And in Twitter's case, it will always be a string. And then the value can be multiple things. It could be a string, it could be nothing, it could be a Boolean, a true false statement. So I'm going to put any object, which is kind of like this catch-all for anything. But that is the long way of typing out a dictionary. Shorthand way to do this, Swift is good for having shorthand things, is to do it this way. String any object, and that creates the exact same thing I just typed out the long way. So the square brackets mean collection, and then this adding this colon here makes it a key value pair collection. If we wanted to do an array, let's see, are any of these arrays? So like withheld in countries, for instance. Once again, the long way to do it is say it's an array of what type? They're strings. Of course, that's optional. Long way. Swift says we got a short, nice little way to do it. So once again, square brackets, collection. Collection of what? Strings. Done. So let's go back here. So retweet count. integer in camel case like I wanted to. Retweet it. Google. Our source string. Our text. Our truncated. Our user. So another custom object, Twitter user. So we're almost done. I already did that. Let's do a health scope string. Alright. Cool. So everything is in. So I do want to talk about this particular field here, text. So in a Twitter response, meaning when I pull it from Twitter's API, it returns text, which is basically, and stay here, this should not be an optional. Text will always be included in a response and is required to post. So to me, that's something that is required. But something to point out here. So like I said, when you get a response from Twitter, it supplies it with text, right? But when you create a tweet, meaning when I post or I send a tweet to Twitter's API, they actually look for a field, a parameter named status. It's also a string. So, interesting. When we write in our code, right, do we want to set both text and status? Or could we implement a getter, or a getter and setter in this case? And I think we should. Why? Well, no matter if I set text or status, they represent the same thing. So that should be reflected within the model. So when I read status, it should give me text. And when I set status, the value of text should be reflected here. So that means status, being that this is a property, status holds nothing. Status just basically just reads and sets for something totally different. So you can see the nature of the function here, because it's performing an operation versus just holding something for you. And so the good thing now is when I set status, it'll set the text, and when I read from status, it'll read from text. So it satisfies our condition when we need to create a tweet, and then it'll also be there when we read a tweet. So duplicate, and I don't know why Twitter did that. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. But so we're pretty much done. Our struct is created. We have some errors because we don't have a Twitter coordinate, Twitter entities object. So just to cheat here, what I'm going to do is quickly create the structs to get this thing to stop crying, if you will. Entities, place, and user. Copy, paste, and copy, paste. Done. So I'm going to hit Command B, and it successfully built. So hey, you just created a struct, your very first struct. Maybe not your very first struct. I don't know what your skill level is, but hey, you did just create a struct, and our first Twitter struct for our Twitter app. So shout out to you. You're awesome. If you like the video, hit like. You want to see more, go ahead and subscribe. Like I said, I'm going to be coming out with a lot of these videos to our Twitter app is up and working. So thanks for watching. See you next time.